Hello and welcome. Hi, I'm Dave, and today we're talking about creating custom hooks in React. Now, this tutorial is part of a Learn React tutorial series, and I'll give a link to the full playlist for the series in the description below. You can see I've got Visual Studio Code open, and I've got the blog project open that we've been working on in this portion of the Learn React tutorial series. I've already got JSON-Server running, as you can see here in the terminal, and in the other terminal window, I've got our React app running. So I can close the terminal window, and if you're not sure about setting those up, please view the previous tutorials in the series. Okay, with both of those running and Visual Studio Code open, I'm going to minimize it at first, and here is our blog application. Now we're going to apply a couple of custom hooks, that's a tongue twister, a couple of custom hooks that we're going to create today. But before we do that, we need to look at the rules of hooks for React. And there's just a few to remember here. One, a very important one, is only call hooks at the top level. So don't call hooks inside loops, conditions, or nested functions. And then a couple of other things to remember. Call hooks from React function components, and you can call hooks from custom hooks. So those are the places we can call them. We can't call them inside of other existing React hooks like useEffect, and we can't call them inside of regular JavaScript functions either. But we can make our own custom hooks, and then we can use other hooks inside of those. So with that said, let's look at just a couple of other things very quickly. I want to call your attention to this website, and I'll give a link to it in the description below, but it's a collection of React hooks because that's what these are. They're kind of like utility functions, but they're in React, and they all start with use, which is another rule of React hooks actually, that we need to define them with the word use to start out with. And they're like recipes. So there can be more than one hook that accomplishes the same thing just because it's had a different author. And this is a good site to search for those on. Also, there is this npm page that's react-use, and it contains several React hooks as well that I think are good. So I'll leave a link to this in the description below as well. I just wanted to draw your attention to those before we come back to our own blog project and create these hooks. So now let's get started in Visual Studio Code. Here in VS Code, I've got the app.js file open, but this is just to have the place in the tree open that we're going to create our hook. Actually, what I want to do is select the source folder and create a new folder inside of it. I'm going to call it hooks. Now you can see the little icon I've even got here with the hook. So if you get the icons, I believe it's VS Code icons extension that I have, you'll probably get something similar. We can create files, of course, now inside this new directory or folder, if you will. And I'm going to call this file use, and that's how we want to start out with every React hook, and then WindowSize. This is a simple hook that will allow me to display how a hook is used to start out with. Then we'll create a more complicated one. But we'll start here with useWindowSize. Now inside this hook, I'm going to import useState and useEffect, because we can use these hooks inside of our custom hook. And now I'm going to say const useWindowSize and set this equal to an arrow function. Now inside the function, we'll start out with a window size and a set window size. So as you can imagine, this is going to use state. And now we'll set the state equal to something we haven't seen previously in this Learn React tutorial series, and this is an object. And I'll set a width, and I'll set this to undefined, because that's truly what it is at this point. It is an undefined value. And the same for the height. So this will get both the width and the height of the browser, so we can identify that in our application. Now after we've set our initial state, we'll use effect as well. An arrow function there. Now for the useEffect dependencies that we'll have at the bottom, we just want this to run at load time, and essentially that is the only time this will run, just as we've discovered with useEffect in other parts of our application. Now let's define a function right here inside of useEffect, and we'll call this handle resize. So this is if the window is resized. And we'll set an arrow function here. And now we'll set the window size, or set our window size state inside of this. And we'll start out with the width. And this will be window.inner width. And then the height will be window.inner height. And that will essentially track the value of the window size if this function is called into action. Okay, now that we have that, we need to go ahead and call that in our useEffect. So we'll have handle resize called into action because we want it to run at load time, and that's what will happen here. Now that's the only time this would actually run this function, handle resize. So we'll get those initial values. So how will we get the values to continue to adjust when the window is resized? Well, we'll do that with an event listener like we would in regular old JavaScript. So we'll add an event listener to the window, window.addEventListener, and we'll listen for the resize event, and then we'll handle the resize, call that function into action. And that's essentially what we need to get those values every time, because we added this listener at the beginning with useEffect when it was loaded, so it only adds it once. But there is something else we need to do, and it prevents a memory leak in our applications, and that is to remove the event listener. Fortunately, useEffect has a cleanup function that will only run when the dependencies change for useEffect, and so we know the dependency won't change here. This is only at load, but it would actually happen on a, say if I change the file and reload, so we'll be able to see that happen, but also it would happen when the application closes out. It would essentially run the cleanup function and remove that event listener. So we can do that. I'll just define cleanup here with a camel case capital U, set this equal to an arrow function, and we'll refactor this in a moment because we can make this a little simpler, but I want to put a console log statement in here so you can see what happens. And we'll say runs if a useEffect dependency changes. And then we'll see that in the log when this runs. And then we'll call window.remove event listener, and this will be the same. Resize event, and we'll be removing the handle resize function from that event. And now we can save this, but we haven't called cleanup into action yet. We just defined cleanup. So all you have to do in useEffect to use the cleanup is the return at the end. So we'll just return cleanup. And now that would be called into action. Okay, we're almost finished with our custom hook, but before we finish, we need to remember to go ahead and return the window size in our hook. This is not in the useEffect, which stopped right here, but this is in the custom hook where we're returning the window size value. And now all that is left to do is export default useWindowSize, and we've completed the custom hook file. And if we scroll back up, we can see we start out and we have useState, useEffect, we define the hook, we set the state, we useEffect, and then the key part here is we want to call it once at load time, call the function we've defined here, handle resize, but then we also want to add an event listener, and so anytime the resize event fires, we continue to call this handle resize function. And then another portion of this is the cleanup function, and that's also important to prevent a memory leak. So now we have completed this entire custom hook, and now let's use it in our application. We'll go back to the app.js file, and inside the app.js file where we have our imports, underneath the API import, we can import useWindowSize, and you can see Visual Studio Code helped out here. It is from .hooks/useWindowSize. So that is exactly what we need, and we can save our file there, but we're just not using it yet. After that, we need to come down underneath where we've defined history, and we'll just pull the width out. Remember, we had an object that had width and height. We only need the width for what we're going to accomplish here. So we'll use useWindowSize, but we'll destructure and just pull the width value out. So now we can save. We'll go ahead and remove this extra line above the or underneath the import of useWindowSize. And then I'm going to scroll down where we're going to use the width, and we're going to pass it into the header. So now we just want width equals width. And that should complete the changes to the app.js file. Now we need to move on to the header.js file. Let's go ahead and add width into the destructured props at the top of the header file. But now we also need to do an import at the top. We're going to import FA laptop, FA, whoa, that changed that completely. We said something too close in our date FNS package here. We need FA laptop. And then we need FA tablet alt, sorry, I spelled that wrong, tablet alt. And finally, FA mobile alt. And these are from React-icons/FA. And I am not so sure that we have React icons installed in this project yet. Let's take a look at our package JSON, and we do not have React icons installed yet. So I need to go back to the terminal window. There we go, because it doesn't have React icons. We got an error where we had React running. I'll stop that temporarily, and I'll do npm I React-icons, and we'll install React icons quickly. React icons has finished installing, and we can see that in our package JSON added to the dependencies. So now I'm ready to restart the React application as well. And with the React application restarted, we'll go back to Visual Studio Code, and I'm going to close out the terminal window again and go back to the header.js file. Here's where we're importing some icons from React icons, and these are font awesome icons that we're going to use in the header based on the width. So now that we have the width destructured along with the title, we can use it here inside of the header. And so now let's base this upon the value of the width. And so I'll type width, and then we'll say if it is less than 768, and this will be a ternary statement, we're going to use the FA mobile alt, not mobile alt, there it is, icon. And then we can say if the width is less than 992, of course this is the false indication, so at this point it is already 768 or greater, but at the same time if it's less than 992, we can say, oh, we'll start another ternary statement, and then we'll say if this is true, we'll have the FA tablet alt. And then finally, if that is false, we'll just show the FA laptop value. There it is. And this will essentially indicate in the header which size we are showing. So if we're showing a mobile phone view, it should show a mobile phone icon. If we're in a tablet view, it should show a tablet icon. And if we're in a laptop or anything larger than a tablet, actually, it should show the laptop icon. So let's save these changes. And now let's go ahead and look at our application and see if the changes are in place. And yes, right now we have a laptop icon in the top right. Now let's go ahead and open up DevTools so we can change the sizing. And I will go ahead and start to shrink this down. And now it's already at tablet. It's a tablet icon. If I make it a little larger, the laptop will come back. There's the laptop, tablet. And now let's go ahead and change in DevTools to a phone. I'll choose the iPhone 6, 7, 8 Plus. And yes, we have a mobile phone icon. So everything works as expected. And I could also shrink it this way. And now we have the phone icon, tablet icon, back to the laptop icon. So our custom hook is working, and we're sending that width value in and changing the icon based on the width value. Okay, I've changed the screen view. Now I have Visual Studio Code on the left, I have our application running on the right, and below I have DevTools open, so you see the console here at the bottom. And you can see I'm getting a warning that says FA Mobile is defined but never used. That is because somehow I not only imported FA Mobile Alt, but also FA Mobile, and I didn't notice or realize that. So let's go ahead and remove that. And if we clear out the console and reload, we should not get any further warnings. That's good. Now let's go to the use window hook that we created. And the one thing I had not demonstrated yet was the cleanup that should log to the window. So this cleanup function. Now, if we just make a change to the file, because again, there's no dependencies here, so it just really needs to reload. And then we save, we should see this message, runs if a useEffect dependency changes. And that's the only way to change the dependency here because we have no other dependency. It just runs at the load time. So that shows you that the cleanup function does indeed run. Now we can actually refactor that cleanup function because I wrote it out to allow for this console log, and then we defined it separately and I just called cleanup here. But what we could do instead of that is just return an anonymous function. So let's put in the parentheses and then an arrow for an arrow function. And now we can just take this line that removes the event listener and put it right there. And that would be the same as having, no, we need the add event listener, the same as having this cleanup function that we call by name or by reference. Let me hide the file tree and you can see it better. So this is our cleanup function. And if you see a return at the end of a useEffect, that is exactly what it is. It is a cleanup function and it removes the event listener. So this accomplishes the same thing, just a little refactor. Not to be confused with the return at the end of our custom hook, but this one is inside of the useEffect. Okay, now that we have added a simple custom hook, and if you search those links I've given in the description below, you should find some other recipes for useWindowSize. It's a very popular hook. Let's do one now that is more complicated, but also very popular, and you will easily find more literature or more videos on it, and that's a useFetch hook. But we'll add a twist, because we're not just going to create a useFetch hook. Since we've already added Axios to our project, we're going to create a useAxiosFetch hook. So let's start by creating a new file, and we'll name this useAxiosFetch.js. With that said, I'm going to hide the file tree so we have more room to type. And now at the top, I'm going to import, and I'll import useState and useEffect once again. And these are from React. And then I'm also going to import Axios from Axios. And now we'll define const useAxiosFetch. This will be an arrow function and it will accept what I'll call a data URL. Now inside this function, we're going to have several pieces of state here. And here, instead of saying posts, we want this to be generic so we could use it in another application. So a custom hook is much like a utility function. So here we'll have data and set data. And we'll set that equal to useState, and we'll put in an empty array. Then we also want to have a fetch error and a set fetch error, and I'll set this equal to useState, and it can just be null. Then we're also going to have a loading state, so is loading and set is loading, and this could also be equal to null to start out with. Now let's create our useEffect. So we'll start with useEffect, have an anonymous function, and now useEffect, we're going to define, we'll call this isMounted, and we really want the component to be mounted and not attempt to apply something after it is unmounted, which would also be a memory leak. So we'll set isMounted to true, and we'll check that status as we apply things. The next is to go ahead and define a source, and this is part of Axios, And you can see this in the Axios documentation, but we'll set a cancel token so we can actually cancel the request if, for whatever reason, the component is unmounted. And we set it by axios.cancelToken.source. And so that is our source. Now we can define our fetch data function inside of useEffect. We'll set this equal to async, and here I'll just call this URL as we define this function. It can sometimes be confusing to accept a parameter we're going to use and then use that same name when you create a definition, because this isn't where we would use it. It's just the definition of the function. So here I'll call this URL. And inside of our fetch data function, the very first thing we want to do is set isLoading to true. And then we will go ahead and try. And inside the try block, we can have a response. And we'll set this equal to await axios.get. We'll have our URL. And now we need to go ahead and apply our cancel token. And this will allow us to cancel the request if we unmount the component. And of course, we can handle that in the cleanup, but we need to set the cancel token here. So here's the cancel token sent with the request. And after we get a response, we want to check once again to see if the component is mounted. And now if it is mounted, we can set the data, and this will be response.data as Axios has, and then set the fetch error to null. And as I think about this null that we used above, I actually think for isLoading, instead of null, we can set it to false to begin with. And then we set it to true when the function is called, and then we can set it back to false otherwise. Okay, so we have checked to see if it is mounted, and we have set the data, and we've set the fetch error to null because there was no error otherwise. So now we've finished our try block, and now we need our catch block. And once we catch an error, and I'll scroll up just a little bit, we once again need to check if is mounted. And if the component is mounted, just like above, we can set the fetch error now instead of the data, and this will be the error.message. And we'll set the data to an empty array because we received an error. And now after that, we'll have a finally block. Once again, scrolling up just a little bit. And inside of the finally block, so this will always happen, once again, want to check if the component is mounted, but here we'll just say is mounted and, so if is mounted is true, then we can go to the next part. And let's go ahead and use a timeout here just so we can see the loading message. We'll come back and change this. You wouldn't want this in your final project here. You just want to do this to display the isLoading message and make sure it's working. So we're going to set isLoading to false, but only after 2 seconds. So that will allow us time to actually see the isLoading message and verify that it is working here as we're in development process. Now that we've completed the fetch data function, we want to go ahead and call fetch data. And remember, the hook receives a data URL as the actual parameter. So the data URL is what we'll pass in. In the definition, we used URL, but above, it actually receives the data URL. So that's what we will call fetch data with. After we call fetch data, let's once again go ahead and define a cleanup here. Camel case cleanup equal parentheses arrow function, and we'll say console.log. Here we'll just say cleanup function so we know it's running. After the cleanup function, we'll set the isMounted to false, and we'll cancel the request. Now if the request is already completed, no harm, no foul. But this will only run once again whenever a dependency changes for the useEffect. With that definition completed, let's go ahead and return the cleanup function. And now we want to set the dependencies for useEffect as well. And the dependency here will be the data URL that is passed in to the useEffect, or actually passed in to the custom hook we have, useAxiosFetch is the data URL. But then if that changes, we once again want to run useEffect. So we'll put that in as the dependency. With that complete, we can return three things from our custom hook. And that's the data that we receive that we have in state, the fetch error, and is loading. So we'll need all three of those things returned from our custom hook. And then once again, now that the hook is complete, we need to export default, and we'll use useAxiosFetch and save. Let's do a quick review before we move on and put this into action. So we've defined our custom hook, we've imported Axios and useState and useEffect. We set different states here at the beginning of the custom hook. We're receiving a data URL, and then we defined our useEffect hook inside here, and we set an isMounted status to true, and we also define a cancellation token for Axios. And then we set the fetch data function. We defined it. And inside of this function, we have a try block, a catch block, and a finally block. We're constantly checking to see if the component is indeed mounted. And if it is, we can go ahead and take action. After we've requested the data, we can set the data state and of course set the error to null. And if we catch an error, we're going to set the error message and set the data to empty array. And finally, this will happen no matter what, whether we're successful with the data or we have an error. We'll go ahead and see if the component is still mounted. And if so, we're going to set isLoading to false. And right now we're doing that with a delay just so we can test our isLoading message. We call that into action with the URL received by the hook. And eventually we can call the cleanup function here that will cancel a request if the component is unloaded during the request. And it will also set isMounted to false. We're returning the data, possible error, and the loading status. And that is our useAxiosFetch custom hook. So now let's put it into action. I'm going to show the file tree quickly just because I want to go to app.js where we can actually apply our custom hook. And the first thing we need to do is import it. So underneath our import of useWindowSize, we can import useAxiosFetch, and this will be from /hooks/ and then useAxiosFetch, there it is. And we can save that much, but after our import, we need to come down to where we've defined the width and useWindowSize, and just underneath that, we can set const, and then equal to, and we can destructure what we're receiving from AxiosFetch, and we've got the data, the fetch error, and is loading. And now let's go ahead and hide the file tree so we have some more room. And this may still extend a little bit, but we're going to set this equal to useAxiosFetch. And now we need to pass in the full URL. This is not like when we set a base URL before. We set up our custom hook to be reusable in other applications. And so there is no base URL currently set. So what we need to do is put in the full URL for our data, and this is JSON-Server URL. You'd need to change this in a production application. But here we've got localhost port 3500/posts, and that is the full URL that we will pass to the useAxiosFetch. Now besides that, oh, and here I set an equal sign there. That's not what we need. There we go. An extra equal sign. Please remove that if you had that. So we've got data, fetch error, and is loading from useAxiosFetch. But we also need to remove this useEffect that we were currently getting our data with, because that would be redundant. So we can go ahead and remove this from our project. But now we have data, but we don't have posts. So there is one more step after we get our data back, and that is to go ahead and set the state as we're using it in the rest of the application. We could just use data if all we wanted to do was to display the post data on this page, but we're clearly doing more than that with it in the application. So I'm going to set a useEffect here. And once we have this useEffect, just inside of it, I'm going to say set posts equal to the data. So it updates our post state. And we only want to do this when the data changes. And that should complete everything we need. So let's go ahead and save. And now we have everything in place except we're not using fetch error or is loading. But notice we did get our posts once again. So that said, let's go ahead and put fetch error and is loading to work. We'll start by scrolling down, and we need to pass these to our home page. So here was our exact path with post and home, but here's what we need. The exact path with the slash. We've got posts equals search results. Let's go ahead and break this to another line now because we're going to have more than one prop to pass along. And we'll say fetch error equals fetch error. And we'll also have is loading equals is loading. Now that finishes the changes for the app.js file, but we need to go ahead and make some changes in the next file. And the next file is the home file. So let's go to home.js, and we need to destructure what we're passing in. So we've got fetch error and is loading at the top. Let's go ahead and hide the file tree once again. Let's start by just removing everything we have between the main elements and starting over in this file. The first thing we'll do is to check if we have is loading. So if is loading is true, we can put 2 ampersands, and then we can set a paragraph. Let's give this a class name equal to status message. And if we haven't defined status message, we will shortly. We'll set this equal to loading posts. And that's essentially all we need. So if that is true, we are loading posts. So we'll save that. Of course, we're not seeing anything right now, but we will here in the near future. On the next line, we'll check to see if we have a fetch error. Once again, 2 ampersands. Another paragraph with the class name equal to status message once again. But also let's set a style right here and set this equal to a color, and it'll be red because we know we have an error. And now inside of the paragraph, we can set the fetch error to display, and it will be red when it displays. And now that we have defined that line, we can add one more line to actually show what we hope to show, and that's not the is loading or the fetch error message, but the actual posts themselves. So here we'll say if we do not have an is loading message and we do not have a fetch error message, and now we'll go ahead and say if the lowercase please posts length, let's set a ternary statement, and here we'll set the feed component, and this will be posts equals posts. I'm going to go ahead and start wrapping some lines here by pressing Alt-Z. Set posts equal to posts, then we can close out this component. And after we close out the component, let's go ahead and put the false part of the ternary statement, and this would be a paragraph. Let's give once again the class name equal to status message. And inside this paragraph, let's just say no posts to display, and save. And we once again have our posts. Now everything seems to be good, but when I reload, there's our loading post message. That's what I wanted to see, and it lasts for 2 seconds, and then we get the posts. So that is correct. Let me make this bigger now that we're not looking at the console. Once again, I'll reload, loading posts, and then we get all the posts later. So that is good. Let's go back to the app.js and let's just make an error on purpose so we know that our error message is also working. And I'll save after creating a problem with the URL. And we got a network error. Let's once again reload. We got loading posts and a network error, and maybe we could eliminate that where we're not getting a loading message at the same time as the error message. So let's go back to home and let's set this equal to no is loading. And we do have a fetch error. If we save, let's go ahead and reload. Loading posts, network error. Now that looks correct. So let's go ahead and go back to our application, fix the URL and save. Now we get loading posts, and then we get the posts, and that's exactly what we want. I'm going to show the file tree once again, go back to our custom hook. Let's find that here, useAxiosFetch, there it is. Hide the file tree, and let's get rid of that timeout in here. So we can just have it to set loading to false. And we know about the cleanup function. We don't really need the console log here, so let's go ahead and remove that as well. But since we're doing two things, let's define this as cleanup and then call it here and leave that like it is. We are setting the isMounted to false, and we're also canceling the request with Axios. So let's save that, and everything is good. It already reloaded, and now when we reload, we barely see that loading post message at all. So we've created two custom hooks today, useAxiosFetch and useWindowSize, and you might find different versions of these out there. Again, they're like recipes or utility functions that you can pull into different projects and use them again and again. Now remember the rules of hooks. There are several, and I will link to those in the description below this video. Hey, thank you guys so much for liking the video if it helped you get started with React. Also, I appreciate you watching and subscribing. It's helping my channel grow. Take care, and I'll see you again very soon.